Hello and kia ora. My name is James Beattie and I'm chair of the Garden History Research Foundation. Among other things, the Garden History Research Foundation aims to promote a wider and more extensive understanding of gardens in their social and historic contexts. On our website, you can see the variety of activities that we get up to, from blogs to talks and many other things besides. So this evening and Karen's morning, it's my pleasure to be able to talk to Karen Jones. Karen is Professor of Environmental and Cultural History at the University of Kent in the UK and has a distinguished career as a teacher, editor, and writer on a variety of topics related to gardens and environment. Here are just some of the many highlights of Karen's work. So with John Wills, Karen has written The Invention of the Park, published by Polity Press, 2005. This overviewed the idea of the park from the Garden of Eden to Disneyland and more. She's also written works which have really reshaped our understandings about animals and parks, which I've used extensively in teaching. For example, Wolf Mountains, the history of wolves along the Great Divide, was a comparative study of the mythology, biology, and culture around wolves in the national parks in the Rocky Mountains, as well as a variety of other works from studies of firearms to hunting and photography. Karen has written the award-winning book on Calamity, The Many Lives of Calamity Jane. And for those of you who haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend it. It's published by Yale University Press in 2020, I think. And as well as publishing, Karen has taught a great many courses at the University of Kent and was also well known to many in the field as editor of the prestigious journal Environment and History, where you were editor for some 10 years or so, I think. Is that right? Yep.
Yeah.
So, Karen, it's lovely to be able to talk to you my evening, your morning, and it's appropriate, I think, that I'm talking to you at a turning point in the Southern Hemisphere as spring approaches and embeds itself in the Northern Hemisphere as we get in the Southern Hemisphere as we get ready to hunker down for winter. So,
That's right.
Karen,
Yeah, it's great to be here.
yeah,
Really
thank
good
you.
to have a
Thank you
chat,
very
James.
much for joining us for this new podcast series. So I'll ask you a few questions and we'll just sort of move on from there and see how the conversation develops. So
Okay.
could you tell us what draws you to garden history?
What draws me to garden history? I think is it's a convergence of two things. Firstly, I'm automatically programmed, I think, to want to be in the outdoors. You know, to just want to be in the dirt, to want to be spending time in in green space, and then my historical brain is really captivated by the ways in which people over time have interacted with green spaces, have created them, have been inspired by them, you know, have transformed them, and also have really, you know, often quite complicated relationships with nature as well. So it's a combination of of emotional connection and intellectual connection, head and heart, I guess, is what takes me to garden history.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, much the same for me too. You need to get your hands dirty, especially when we're locked behind desks for most of our
For
careers.
sure, I think
Um,
it's was it Donald Worster who said that the environmental historian has to, you know, put on a pair of walking boots and get out there and
yeah.
interact with the landscapes that they're writing about. Otherwise, you can't really know them. You can't truly apprehend them, I don't think.
How did you first stumble across garden history and how did you get into it?
I got into it through the park,
Mm,
and then I jumped over the fence, or
yeah.
climbed up the ha ha back into the garden, I suppose. So yeah, I got really interested as a master's student in environmental history generally, and then particularly interested in conservation, wildlife, and nature protection. So I started out with the national park, across a global geography. So I was really interested in, as an MA student, in parks in Africa and North America. And then when I did my PhD, as you've introduced, I worked on North America, the west of North America, on Yellowstone, Glacier, Banff and Jasper, looking at the history of wolf extermination and then recovery. So I guess I've always had that, what hooked me in to an academic career was an interest in designed landscapes and the way that those are put together and how they change over time. And then I became really interested by the idea of what a park was, and how this concept is applied across the world in so many different spaces, in so many different contexts, and yet is really malleable and really flexible. So you can use it in urban space, in comparatively wild space, in huge arenas, and then really tiny ones. So yeah, I came to garden history through the public garden, I suppose, in terms of the city park. So that's been my interest in tracking that landscape history through the park story, and then more recently in thinking about public gardens and parks in the 19th century city and how they functioned as sites of well-being and sort of civic uplift, but also control. So all the sorts of textures you get when you look at a garden or park space.
Yeah. Now this is a question I like to ask all of my guests. So what for you, and in part it comes from the difficulty of kind of defining things myself, what for you is a useful working definition or working idea of garden history? And what does garden history involve for you?
Okay. Well, I've spent a bit of time trying to think about what's the difference between a park and a garden, because those two are, often interchangeable, particularly in public space. But I guess for me, garden history is about it's about I'd see a garden as an enclosed space, something that's demarcated, something that is designed, but something that contains that is marked by a story about planting and a story about green things, but also contains a route into so many other stories too. So it's a really social space, it's a really political space, it can be an economic space. So it's, for me, it's as the stories in it are as variegated as the things that get planted in it. And that's what I think really fascinates me about the possibilities of studying garden history, that there's so many places, so many geographies, and so many stories that we can tell.
Thank you. And do you teach garden history at University of Kent?
I dip into it. Yeah. I dip into it because the courses that we have are necessarily broader. So I do try to convert students in their first year as history undergrads to garden history we have a course on the making of modern Britain, and in the 19th century part of that, obviously the city looms quite large. Yeah. And so I take the license to bolt on to the story of urban industrialism, the ways in which cities try to make themselves livable. So that, that ends up being about sanitation and health, but also parks. So yeah, I sort of give them some introductions, and then I teach a course in the second and third year on British environmental history, and we think about gardens in that context in different ways. But yeah, I'd love to have the opportunity to teach a unit on garden history. I've done a summer school occasionally on the park, which is sort of loosely based on the Invention of the Park book, and that was loads of fun. And I do have students who end up working on garden history dissertations. So who I've got a couple at the moment. One working on local urban parks, another working on the site-specific history of an English stately home. So there are. I think those sorts of topics those sorts of teaching packages lend themselves to garden history really nicely.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you and I have edited a special issue of Environment and History on Garden and Environmental History. And you sort of alluded to some of the connections in your earlier answer, but I'd be interested to hear your views on what the relationship is between garden history and environmental history.
Well, I think, I mean, like you, James, I think I've always been someone who likes to find the gaps between scholarships and likes to like move in different spaces and doesn't get too hung up on the if you like ownership of particular methods and methodologies. I'll just give a go at understanding the work that's been produced by scientists, even though I don't have scientific training or botanical training and such like. But I think historically, garden history has probably been, more connected to landscape history, and has been, I suppose, focused around particular spaces or particular particular exponents of the craft.
Yeah.
Whereas environmental historians have been, I think, keener to look at environmental problems, or to think in a more of a macro scale about, empire or industrialism. So I think there's a really nice space in between those arenas where you can, join together those different strands and make, and I guess, garden histories can often be site specific.
Yeah.
As well. and I think it's really, I really enjoy thinking about what different landscapes share, what connects them. But I think the boundaries are very porous, but there's often there's still so much that can be done in terms of having those conversations across those areas.
And when you sort of talked about the sort of landscape history and gardens being considered within that, were you thinking more in terms of the Lancelot capability Brown and the elite landscape designers rather than the?
I guess so. I guess so. If you look at the material that's been produced on design and landscape form, I guess it focuses quite a lot on the creation of particular features in the garden, or the career biographies of particular individuals like Capability Brown, and or the national habits of how gardens are produced and refined. But I guess that thinking about how the garden relates to the spaces around it, both in terms of immediate proximity, but also the sorts of the things that intrude upon the garden, whether that is pollution or whether that is noise. That the garden does, for me anyway, the garden can't exist as a space set apart from what's
Yeah.
going on in the world around it. And I think that's where environmental history can be really useful in connecting those threads together without losing the core of I think the detail of garden history is really commendable, and I really like that aspect of it, and that attention to the ground and the materiality of it, but bringing it all together is also feels appropriate.
And why do you think there aren't as many collaborations, say, between garden historians and environmental historians as you might sort of first think?
My hunch is that people, yes, historically, people were drawn to environmental history as a way of thinking through, why we got into the mess we're in,
Yeah.
and those sort of bigger problems of modernity, whether that's chemicals or nuclear pollution. Whereas I guess garden history maps onto an older type of landscape history, a more traditional. I suppose perhaps the first wave of environmental history, which was more interested in conservation movements and the protection of nature. So I think that there's a sort of a misjudgment that garden history is confined somehow, and it's provincial in some way, which is I think it's a real mistake to just think that actually garden history is the sort of preserve of the state, the history of the stately home or something like that.
Yes.
Because there's so much more, and I think when you look at the way in which that scholarship is being interrogated by by the work that you do, the work that Corinne Fowler has done on stately homes and empire in Britain, for instance. The sort of, I think the new garden history is much more, brings together much more of these elements. But I think it's curious to me as someone who's already always lived in that space, why environmental historians are not so inclined. I mean, what's your take on that, James?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element, as you point out, of there being two different traditions, that older landscape tradition and environmental history tradition, which really emerged in the 70s as out of the Green movement, out of the political protest against pollution and a variety of other issues around that time in the West. So I think there's those different trajectories, and also maybe looking at it from the perspective from, say, the Southern Hemisphere. It was often studied, not landscape history or gardens weren't studied by historians. They'd be studied more by literary scholars or translators or, landscape people who study landscape as a sort of science, almost, and landscape design. Changes in form rather than necessarily embedded form of a garden, rather than it necessarily be embedded in a sort of social or wider political context. And I suspect it's sort of there are those factors at play, and that misperception too, as you say, that garden history is somehow parochial and unimportant, whereas it's far from it the case. And I guess speaking um, from the academic tradition that I'm familiar with, which is in Aotearoa, New Zealand, a lot of studies of gardens have taken place, but it's been by archaeologists in the so-called prehistory of Māori
Yeah,
gardens and gardening practices based on the material evidence. So again, quite a different approach, but not much more in the historic times. There have been some notable exceptions, but in the sort of post-contact period, not a great deal of work in that area.
yeah, yeah. And I think my I suppose the area that I'm most familiar with is the European and North American dimension. But the traditions of garden history, say like in China, which I
Yeah,
know that you have a lot of expertise in there. I think that those different geographies
yeah,
are also part of this story in their different scholarly traditions.
yeah. Which sort of brings me nicely onto if you are happy to talk about maybe your current project and then your most recent one
Mm,
on the lungs of the city.
mm.
Um, so currently
Yeah.
you've
So
just been
sorry, carry on.
yeah. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, yeah. It's in the last, let me think, last few years, I've been working on a project that takes the city park as an entity, as a part of an urban metabolism that's consciously set up in the 19th century to make the city a healthy place. So this project is took the idea of the park as the urban lung and explored where the genesis of that term in London and the ways in which you see the term being used all over the world in many different
Mm,
park spaces. And it tries to think about the ways in which the designers of the 19th century, or those who were reformulating old parks, so royal elite spaces, or creating brand new ones, the ways in which they were thinking about ventilation, circulation, uh, water, air, exercise, and principally the working class citizens of urban space, and the way greenery was seen as a prescription to save people from the industrial condition, to give them somewhere healthy to breathe and to walk, to provide a leisure activity that was more wholesome than going to the pub or gambling
yeah.
or whatever. And so yeah, this project thought about how this manifested in London. It also looked at city parks too in New Delhi and in Shanghai, to think about how that intersected with questions of different geographies, but also empire, and then what happens over time as those spaces are claimed by different constituencies. So I guess it's trying to historicize some of the things we know about parks today, that they're really important vectors to address urban environmental problems of flooding, of heat concentration, of filtering hydrocarbons, and also perform a really important physical and mental well-being function for people as well. So it's thinking about the ways in which what we know scientifically about these spaces now actually was was part of the discourse of the people who created these spaces, even though they didn't have the same knowledge sets about the the data. They were
Yeah.
still thinking about these things, but in more abstract terms.
Yeah. I mean, I always find it fascinating. I almost think that science has finally caught up with sort of the 19th century in terms of
I like that. Yeah,
the
that's really
importance
putting it. Yeah.
of having green space for mental well well-being, the importance of the plants for, removing, as they in the 19th century would have called it, miasma, bad airs, um,
Mm, mm.
and all manner of sort of roles for these gardens, and also the important thing is that these garden parks, the today are the legacy of the decisions made a couple of hundred years ago. So aside
Yeah.
from all those additional benefits, they're the sort of physical legacy of the 19th century
Yeah. Yeah, that's
as
true.
well.
Definitely. And I think um, thinking about how they are spaces of intangible heritage, and often places that are under threat from development today. And I think history can be really helpful as a way of reconnecting people to those spaces by sort of by genealogies, that people have long histories of going to these areas when they're kids or when they're parents, and by connecting neighbourhood to green space, I'd like to think that history can help build advocacy, um, to think about how green heritage is a really important part of protecting that legacy, and seeing the value of spaces beyond, what they might be for real estate or something like that.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And I was going to ask you too about the parks themselves. When you're doing garden history, what sources do you use? How do you sort of go about doing garden history?
Mm. Um, I mean, there are so many things. I mean, I really enjoy looking at original plans for parks and gardens. I think that's a great way of thinking about the visions of the people who are wanting to set these spaces up. How does the design eye connect with the material space, and what's sort of the co-produced consequence of that? So I really enjoy the architectural plans, and the sort of philosophical and practical papers that are produced by people like Frederick Law Olmsted, writing about parks and towns in the 19th century US. That I think that you can get a real insight into their function by that sort of material. Equally, though, there are some great sources that talk that from literature or from biography about people's engagements with particular park space. Obviously, government records and that official material that pertains to the bureaucratic story. I've found newspapers too a valuable repository for connecting to, say, particular events or moments or controversies in particular park histories. Photographs, historic photographs, artistic works that are depicting either idealized or more intricate views of the park. And the landscape itself, if you go and walk around a space and look at the sorts of features that are there, it can yield new avenues for research, whether that's thinking about, the a statue or railings, or a particular feature like a swimming pool or a kid's sandpit. All of these
Yeah.
things have histories. One of the aspects, though, I really is more recent, and I think is an interesting, I guess, historical source to think about movement and the way in which people use space, is the desire paths that are created in
Oh, yes.
green spaces in the summer, where people cut corners to make their own routes from A to B through a park or a public garden, if they're allowed to, of course. and viewed from the air, you can see these informal new pathways, and that's again a new story about how these places are utilized, or where are people congregating. One of the things that I did as part of the Lungs for the City project, and which has had an afterlife in some other parks, was the use of oral histories as well to map out a more recent engagement with green space, to think about where have been the favourite places of people and why. So, and that's been a really nice way of embedding the garden in a community story, to take the everyday tales of the place where people, the hill where people used to take their sledges when it snowed, or the place where they would picnic. Or I did an event in a school a month or so ago, and some of the kids were saying they really enjoyed going to sit on a bench before school and just kind of taking that moment, which was really heartening to hear, actually, that that sense of connection with greenery is bringing that inspiration before you go into the melee of school in the morning.
I was going to ask you too. I'm aware that we're sort of moving towards the end of our allotted time for the interview. Could you just share with us some of your upcoming work and some of the things that you're working on related to gardens or otherwise?
Sure. So the most recent thing I've produced is called Beastly Britain, which is an animal history of Britain in 10 animals, some real, some ancient, some imaginary. James very kindly looked at my chapter on the ghost dog
Yeah.
a while back. And so that's not about gardens, but it is about the way in which people and other species interact with space, and the ways in which natural and cultural histories are entwined. So that was fun. That's just come out on audiobook, which is new for me. And that's again, that used lots of different source materials to build up a story about relationships between people and place and species. And then the project I've got two projects really active at the moment. The Lungs for the City still continues with some work with English heritage on some local sites in the UK, thinking about people's interaction with the outside spaces of heritage areas over time. And but the other big project that I will be working on later this year is for the next few years is a history of environmental protest in Britain over the last couple of centuries. So gardens and the protection and preservation of green space will be a part of that, but it also takes in those stories about pollution and food and transport and all of the kinds of things that that we would think of as aspects of I suppose, a protest story. Why ordinary folk become environmental activists, and what are the things they care about, and what have they done to improve the world around us, and what can we take from that in our present. So that's where I'll be spending my time in the next few years.
Oh, that sounds wonderful, Karen, and I look forward to um, hearing more about the latest research and the ongoing research related to lungs of the city too. And I might see if you can share with me some of the links to these projects so I can put them in the podcast details too, because I'm sure
Yeah,
there'll be
sure.
lots of people interested in that. Yeah.
Yeah, very happy to. There's a nice one of the lungs for the city. One of the things that we produced was a kind of a park notice board for Victoria Park in London, which talks about the historic connections of health and people in garden space, but also thinks about why people seek out greenery, and what it brings to us, and why it inspires us, and why we care about it.
That's marvelous. Thank you again, Karen, for
Well,
joining
thank you.
us on this podcast.